Thank you for caring about this work and for being part of the solution. Let's build more. I would like to turn it over to Senator Edwards to continue. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. And thank you for your opening remarks, really helping to set the stage and understanding the urgency of what we are facing. At the same time, this conversation and this report meets the urgency with a level of accuracy that has been honestly lacking. Just looking at what we're dealing with, we can easily reduce this, not reduce, but at least focus this conversation on what is to be built. But what I like about this report is, who is it to be built for? It is not enough to discuss the structures and the quantity, as just was heard. We really do need to see about the quality and the locations and the size and sizing our housing stock to our current population. Otherwise, this historic moment where we have a historic amount of bond funding and we're dealing with a crisis and a will for the first time, I think, that is collective to build more, could miss the mark. And this report is really at a granular level has helping people who are part of the solution. For me, especially, I'm excited because so much of what I've had to do as a city councilor and now senator is figure out how we're going to get things done. And once you go through all of the controversy and the back and forth and the zoning and the constant conversations, oftentimes controversial, the fights that could last for years and the appeals after those fights and so on and so forth, to finally get a negotiated project and then it doesn't meet the needs of the population around. It is a hollow victory. So the goal, I believe, is this tool will now assure that when we have a victory, it is something that is truly celebratory and will last generations because we're building in a right-size way and in geographic locations. And I think it's very important that this is a people-centered conversation we're having. This is a family-centered conversation. This is a conversation about veterans. And when we talk about low income, when we talk about middle income individuals, I want people to be very clear, or extremely low income, that we don't miss the fact that these are some of the hardest working people in the Commonwealth. Okay. Low income does not mean lack of work. And so when you're dealing with low income, you oftentimes, or extremely low income, you're dealing with people with not one, but two jobs. So location matters. The ability to get to work, or the ability to plan for housing near an industry versus what oftentimes happen is it just happens to be available land in the middle of wherever, and we're going to buy it, and then we'll just develop a community there. That can miss the mark when your workforce is one place, but what you're building is someplace else. And that results in another injustice, which is extremely long commutes. And we are still building out that infrastructure, as you know, with even assuring that we have public transportation that's affordable and also not hours long. What this report does for me and for a lot of people is really demonstrate how connected it all is. If you do not build the right size, the right quantity, in the right locations, then this is a lot of time, a lot of money that will not be accurately solving our housing crisis. Indeed, it might even exacerbate it, because now we have the argument from local cities and towns. We built what we could, we built how we did, and it's there. And that's not enough. So this is a great conversation starter. This is a great tool. And I hope that you will have annual or reports that are lasting every 5 years, because I don't believe populations are stagnant. We change in our family sizes, where we're moving, where we're being displaced. And so if your planning is part of that, and hopefully this report becomes a regular thing, so we can constantly be accurately meeting the moment. I want to thank you so much for your hard work. I want to thank you, MAPC, and all of those partners who are part of this huge conversation, and consistently providing the receipts, as the kids say, to making sure that when we do big things, we do them in the right way. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Senator Edwards and Jerome, for framing the conversation. I can move us into the research now. Thanks, Zoe. Great. So thank you everyone for joining us. My name is April Ognabeni. I am the COO at Housing Navigator, and I was on the research team. We are, as you heard, we're just really excited to be able to look at this topic with much more nuance, much more focus on the renter, and a much closer look at the inventory than we've been able to do with any research before this. So I know on this call we have 120 people listening. Many of you reflect local and state leadership, community advocates, service providers. We have developers on the call. We hope you'll hear something new here that will help you connect your work to a more nuanced understanding of demand. And today we're going to walk you through some brief context for the project. We'll talk about top-level findings, give you some policy and research recommendations, and then we'll save a chunk of time for questions at the end. So for that, as we're talking, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom, and we'll be either answering questions directly in Zoom as we go, or we'll be holding some for verbal discussion. So just to give you a quick introduction to the project team, this was a really collaborative project that we were excited to embark on. It enabled us to really just kind of pool our different skill sets and shared subject matter expertise to tackle this problem. So we were excited to work with the MAPC team, which included Zoe Iacovino, Lily Perkins High, and Jesse Partridge Guerrero on the data services team, and then Andrea Harris-Long on the housing and land use team. On the Housing Navigator side, the research team consisted of myself, Jennifer Gilbert, and Emma Ryle. Jennifer has since moved on to another position at CHAPA, but we wish her well. We send her a special thank you, and she sends her regrets for not being able to make it today, but the rest of the research team will be fully available for the Q&A at the end. And we can move to the next slide. So this research is one in a series of Housing Navigator reports. If you're unfamiliar with our organization, we are a tech for good nonprofit working to connect people with a place to call home. We do that right now primarily through a search tool that's used by over 400,000 unique renters each year. And that enables them to see what kind of income restricted housing is available in Massachusetts and then when it's available. So powering the search tool is a data set that took, as Jerome indicated, many years, a lot of collaborations with public agencies, work with over 70 owners and managers to put together. And we're constantly cleaning it to make sure that we're giving accurate information to renters. So that resulting data set, as it mentions here, is more inclusive and detailed than the subsidized housing inventory. That's the tool that a lot of localities use and most researchers have leaned on before in their studies of Massachusetts affordable housing. And the data set covers all income restricted rental housing available to the general public. So it's a really comprehensive data set that enables us to answer questions like this. So when we completed that data, we wanted to use it to support our mission. So if we can go back to the slide, just one more. I just want to highlight and make sure that you all know that we do make this data available to the general public through data dashboards that are accessible on our website. That's going to show summary level information at a state and town level. And we hope that's really useful to any community advocate or policy professional anywhere kind of on the housing spectrum. And then we have this research series where we do a deeper look. We engage with people with analytical expertise like MAPC. The first report in our series was on the accessible housing in our data set. And then this is the second. And now we can go forward. I'll explain why we were super excited to do this project, because when we completed our data set, we knew we wanted to use it to build better. That was our primary goal, was showing renters more of the homes that they want to see on our website. So we brought our data set and this question to MAPC. What can our data on affordable housing tell us about the types of affordable housing most needed in Massachusetts? And I will now pass this on to Zoe, who led most of the analytical work, who can walk through the high-level findings.
Great, thank you so much, April. And MAPC was so excited when Housing Navigator brought this question to us. because we were really excited for the opportunity to work with them, their expertise in affordable housing, their relationships with affordable housing providers, as well as this wealth of data that we were now able to dig into. So together we came up with a research question of how many low-income renter households are not being served by affordable housing. And we used data at the statewide and regional planning agencies to start to answer this question. And we began by defining who we wanted to really look at as a part of this analysis. And those were low-income renter households. We used HUD's definition of low income, which the actual dollar amount varies region to region, but it's $65,000 to $105,000 for a household of 4. And we found that there are 652,000 renter households who fall into that income limit. We further broke down the low-income renter households by income groups. So extremely low-income households make up almost half of low-income renter households. And these are often older adults on fixed incomes, but they're also working people, daycare employees, people in the food industry, such as bakers, who are making more than minimum wage in these jobs, yet still are the lowest income folks in Massachusetts. We then have the kind of middle tier of very low income household. These are people in the creative industries, music and film, as well as home health aides. And then the highest section of the low income households are the moderately low income households. And these are often retail workers, people who work in manufacturing. All of these households, all of these people are incredibly important parts of our economy and our communities, yet they struggle to find a place to live that is affordable. So we took Housing Navigator's data of income restricted housing and filtered it to the housing that is affordable for these households, restricted to be affordable for these households. And we analyzed the gaps on 3 different levels. We first looked at income and rent type. What is the gap based on income, and really trying to figure out how income shapes access to affordable housing. We then looked at household composition. What is the gap based on age and household size? Really trying to understand how regulations and the characteristics of affordable housing shape access. And then we turned to a data set that MAPC creates and maintains of household projections for 2030 and 2050 to understand how this gap is going to grow in the future. So I'll start with our first level of analysis, which was on income and rent type. And we found right off the bat that 2/3 of low-income households fall into this affordable housing gap of looking for an income restricted unit. And that's about 441,000 households across the state. And we define this gap for the rest of the report as unstably housed. We define this term as not having access to an income restricted affordable housing unit, meaning that they're vulnerable to rent increases, to condo conversions and housing speculation. They experience high degrees of rent burden and overcrowding, where multiple families might live together in order to afford the rent. These are the real human stories that are behind all of this data and what make this gap so important to understand. Now, our supply of affordable housing in this low income range is 212,000 units across the state. And this supply breaks down into 2 rent types. There's rent based on income, which is the largest portion of this low income housing supply, and fixed below market rent units. Rent based on income are oftentimes public housing. They're guaranteed affordable. So a household is only going to pay 30% of their income in one of these units. Fixed below market rent units are often created through inclusionary zoning, 40B, LIHTC funded projects. And there the income is set by the property. So it's not necessarily tied to what the household can afford. And we discovered that these differences are actually really important to understanding how affordable housing meets the needs of low-income households. And we'll give a potential example. There is a hypothetical household in Amherst, Massachusetts, making $31,000. This would make them a very low-income household by the HUD standards. They could be eligible for either of these two units. A rent based on income unit that is set at 80% AMI or less for income eligibility. And that would be a perfect unit for this family. Even though they're making less than 50% AMI, it would be guaranteed affordable to them. They'd only pay $780 a month. But we realized as we started to do the analysis that if we only looked at the listing eligibility for units, we would miss how rent based on income units are actually essential to meeting the needs for deeply affordable housing. We similarly discovered a challenge for the fixed below market rate units, where even though on paper this household would be eligible as they make less than 60% of the area median income, the rent that that apartment would be set at would leave them severely cost burdened, paying more than 50% of their income. So we had to design, as a part of our analysis, a way to treat these two different rent types. So we set a couple rules. Our analysis for fixed below market rent units came out of interviews that Housing Navigator did as a part of this research with affordable housing providers to understand how they do this match in real life. And they learned that while there is a listing maximum income for most of these fixed below market rent units, there is also essentially a minimum. And that is about 10 percentage points of the area median income below that listing eligibility. So for the household in Amherst, the listing is at 60% AMI, but a minimum income for that unit would be 50% AMI. That household makes less than 50%, so they would actually be, by our analysis, ineligible for that unit. For the rent based on income units, because we wanted to really understand how they are serving the needs of deeply affordable housing, we turn to HUD's residency data of public housing, where they break down for all of the public housing in Massachusetts what the income groups renting each unit are, so that we're able to get a sense of how many extremely low income, very low income, and moderately low income households are making use of RBI units. And we found that the gap is largest for the lowest income households, that there are 194,000 households across Massachusetts with incomes at or below 30% AMI who are unstably housed. And that's about 44% of the entire gap of 441,000 households. Very low income households make up the next largest portion of the gap. And we discovered something interesting about them as well, that they are actually the least served by affordable housing because of these rent types, where 81% of very low income households are unstably housed, meaning only 19% are actually able to access affordable housing using the rent types. Another interesting aspect that we discovered looking at it this way is that rent based on income is the main form of affordable housing that extremely low income households have access to, while moderately low income households rely more on the fixed below market rent units. And we can put this all together with this visualization that we'll make sure goes out for you to explore on your own. But we have at the state level and for each of the RPAs, how the affordable housing supply for the state and each of the region serves different income groups. So we can see that the 2/3 of the state fall into unstably housed. Most extremely low income households are using rent based on income units, while moderately low income households are relying on the fixed below market rate unit. And in between, we have the very low income households in the gap who are only able to access a few RBI and fixed below market rate units, and most fall into unstably housed. But there's one more piece of the puzzle on income, and those are mobile vouchers. Now, unfortunately, we don't have enough data to really fold in mobile vouchers to our analysis, but we know from how they're used in other states that probably about 20% of Massachusetts' 78,000 mobile vouchers are being used in fixed below market rent units. So that's going to start to tip the scales back towards extremely low and very low income households who might want to make use of a fixed below market rate unit. Our hypothetical family in Amherst, if they had a mobile voucher in their hands, they would be able to rent that 60% AMI unit and afford the rent there. So it really does make a difference. And we know that there's another 66,000 mobile vouchers being used in the market that start to fill that gap. But unfortunately, we don't have the data yet to really get a sense of how and who are using those vouchers. So that wraps up our income analysis of the affordable housing supply. The next piece that we looked at was household composition. And we began again by breaking down our 652,000 low-income households into groups. These are the three largest household types that we identified in order to match them to certain unit characteristics. So we start with small households. These are one person or a two-person couple with a householder under 60, making them ineligible for an age-restricted unit. And the type of unit that they would be most suitable for is a one-bedroom studio or an SRO. We then have small older adult households. These are, again, one person or a two-person couple, but now over the age of 60 and therefore eligible for an age-restricted unit. We then have medium households. We can consider these family households. They are 2 to 4 people with children, and they're looking for 2 to 3 bedroom households. Because there are children, they are ineligible for an age-restricted unit. And these 3 household types make up 75% of the low-income households in Massachusetts. Apologies that my data is not showing up on this pie chart, but we have in this quadrant small non-older adult households. These are small older adult households. These are our family units. These are larger family units, 3 or more children. And then this final wedge I'll come back to. They are what we called administratively ineligible. And I'll explain more what I mean by that in a moment. But you can see, looking at the distribution of households to suitable units, that there is a bit of a mismatch when you're looking at age restriction. And that was one of our key findings, that small households of every age have the largest gap. There are 6 small low-income renter households for every available one-bedroom non-age restricted unit available. Most of these small households are not eligible for age-restricted units, and that households with children and older adult households have similar levels of need. But the projections do show that small older adult households are going to increase in number by 2050. So we'll keep that in mind for the last section. And we calculated these gaps by taking the number of households and comparing it to the number of suitable units. So small non-older adult households are 177,000. They are looking for only 49,000 non-age restricted studios, one bedrooms, and SROs, which leaves a gap of 4 households per available unit. However, small older adult households are 197,000. They are looking at 78,000 age restricted small units, leaving a gap of 3 households per available unit. Medium households are 146,000. There are 77,000 non-age restricted 2 and 3 bedroom units, which again leaves a gap of 2 households per available unit. Another interesting aspect of this housing supply is that for small non-older adult households and their non-age restricted supply, most of those units are fixed below market rent. So we know that they're serving slightly more moderately low income households. Small older adult households and age restricted units tend to be rent based on income. So we know they're going to serve extremely low income households a bit more. But we also know that if an older adult household is not able to access an age-restricted unit, they're going to go back into that demand pool for a non-age-restricted unit. So we added the gap between supply and demand for our older adult households into the demand for non-age restricted units for folks who are ineligible for them, and found that really the number of households who are looking for an income restricted 1-bedroom apartment is closer to 247,000 small households, leaving us with a gap of 6 households per available unit. And that's where the age restriction really shows its limitation. Even though 50% of small households are not eligible for an age-restricted unit, more than 61% of our affordable housing stock is age-restricted. And there's a geographic component too, which brings us back to what Senator Edwards was saying about where we're building this housing. 25% of Massachusetts cities and towns have more than 75% age-restricted affordable housing. And 11% of all cities and towns have only age-restricted affordable housing. So if you are households with children, if you're grandparents raising your grandchildren, you are ineligible for affordable housing because there is no affordable housing for you in your community. And that's a big problem. And it's where really thinking about how and where we're building our affordable housing becomes so important. And that brings me back to the administratively ineligible households. We discovered as we were doing this household analysis that there are some households that don't fit into these traditional definitions of families and small households. These are medium and large roommate households, 2 or more people who would need at least a 2-bedroom. These are multi-generational households and other non-traditional family structures who, by current administrative rules around roommates, multiple generations in affordable housing, don't fit into our affordable housing supply. And it makes up about 15% of low-income households. There's also a chance that because we are not sure for roommate households if they're living together out of personal preference or financial necessity, we're not sure whether or not we're actually undercounting the demand for 1-bedroom apartments. So one of our recommendations is going to be further studying housing choice and what brings people to their homes. And I'll wrap up by looking at how our demand for age or income restricted housing is going to grow. And I think it will come as no surprise that the gap is going to grow in the coming decades. We grouped the projections with the same methodology that we did our gap analysis and found that we're going to see the most growth of small, non-older adult households. Again, these are folks who are looking for 1-bedrooms. But the small, older adult households are the largest group, and they're going to remain the largest group for the next couple decades. And that's also true for the extremely low income households. in our low-income population, where they are the largest group by far of our low-income households, and that high share is only projected to grow into the future by another 50,000 households. So this might seem somewhat dire, but there is hope because we are here, we understand the problem. And I'm going to pass it back to April to talk about our next steps and potential solutions.
Great, thank you, Zoe. So yeah, the goal of all of this analysis and these somewhat surprising findings is to give us some direction for how to move forward. And for this, we're going to present a couple of policy recommendations, and we've focused at the local and the state level, just kind of given the broader context that we're in. Obviously, everything is connected and nested, but again, that was the perspective that we tried to be thinking through. So we can go to the next slide. So this first set of recommendations links back to that finding around households of 50% area media income or less being the most underserved. So we call it making affordable housing more affordable, lowering that rent so that more low-income households can live in the affordable housing without cost burden. So to reach these households, it's pretty hard to offer the level of rent needed without using multiple tools. So a lot of our recommendations focus on how you can layer tools. And our first recommendation is to look at the existing portfolio of income restricted housing that might be tooled more towards the 60%, the 80% AMI households, and layer project-based vouchers on top of them, whether they come from the local level, the state level, the federal level, to be able to reach a broader range of households in those units. The second set of recommendations around this is looking towards the new units that we're creating. From a state level, that might mean adapting the QAP so that projects that are able to go beyond the existing threshold requirements that are there now for deeply affordable units can receive some type of preference or priority if they can creatively find a way to exceed that. From a city's perspective, you can look at layering municipal capital subsidies like Community Preservation Act funds with the 40B or inclusionary developments that are already in your pipeline so that, again, you can kind of move beyond those traditional 80% AMI units and reach broader number of households. And then finally, we recommend looking at adjusting inclusionary zoning policies to serve households in that 30 to 50% band. Some communities are already doing it, so it can be done, but we recommend that localities look into what that might look like in their region. We can go to the next slide. So the second set of recommendations focuses on this increase of access for households that have few to no options as we surfaced in our research. So the first one points back to that map that Zoe shared, where there's 25% of Massachusetts towns that do not offer any non-age restricted housing. So really working through the QAP at a state level, which I realized I did not define that before. The Qualified Allocation Plan is the state's primary document to guide how it invests its money. So it's a really good tool for kind of adjusting our preferences and encouraging developers with what to build. So one recommendation is to use that as a tool to encourage the development of non-age restricted housing in these areas. And then for all of those of you working at a local level, to use the local permitting process to encourage that as well. And again, the intention there is just so that there's more options for everyone in that community. The other set of recommendations is around that sort of the hunk of households on that pie chart that are living in configurations that would be ineligible for affordable housing under the current occupancy standards. So as Zoe alluded to, we need to understand whether that's by choice or by preference, and dig into that to understand the full extent of demand for one-bedroom households. I think this research surfaced that there are small households of all ages and types, older and younger, that need one-bedroom households, and that's important to keep in mind as we're building. But there's this other piece that we weren't able to tackle that should be looked at, I think, particularly on a more local level. And then kind of alongside that, this is not often talked about in major policy discussions, but modernizing occupancy standards so that we can account for the way that people want to live. We can keep rolling from there. So in terms of ideas for future research, we had quite a few. Probably unsurprisingly, since this was our first first bite at the apple with this new data. And we found there were a few areas, we're calling this deepening the research. There's a few areas we were just missing data sets to be able to dig in more. So that was connected demographic data so that we can understand both how households are structured and where they're living. It was complete housing accessibility data. Both of our organizations were really sad to not be able to include this variable and look at it because it's such an important part of how the built environment does or doesn't meet the needs of the population. So on that, as we mentioned here, Housing Navigator is kind of hand building with owners and managers this data set that's currently just over a majority of the affordable units. We need to keep moving that along, get that closer to 100%. And we also are missing data, good data on demand for accessible units to pair with it. And then the last piece is more data on mobile rental vouchers. So as Zoe alluded to in this report, we use some back of the envelope calculations to estimate how the impact of vouchers might impact the findings. But we're really missing and hopeful for data about who's using them, but more importantly, where they're being used in terms of overlap with the current affordable housing supply or even just the geography where they're being used so that we can be equally detailed and nuanced about this type of affordable housing. Great. And then these ideas to kind of build on the research and grow. Again, quite a few ideas. And the one I really want to spotlight is the first one. I think for most of us on the project, this was actually the key takeaway, was the need for more participatory research. So we kind of took the quantitative approach. We did what we could with this new data set. We were able to get at affordability and eligibility as we could understand them from how they were currently structured in the industry. But we couldn't get at this like want or desire. And it's really important that we talk directly with renters to inform that. We can't claim to know what renters want or need without talking to them. Both of our organizations believe really strongly in that, so that this really feels like the necessary next step coming from this research. Beyond that, other ideas include digging more into the access to income restricted housing. Why do we see some resources distributed in the way that we do across households? Looking at local trends and local policies. I'll note that this report comes with a story map that's going to be on MAPC's website. That's going to have visualizations that you can toggle between the state and your local planning region. So if that's of interest to you, please dig into that now or after the call. Other ideas are how naturally occurring affordable housing fills the gap, and then looking at how, if we change what we build, how does that impact our future projections? Great, and so that wraps up kind of our high-level overview of the report. Again, I hope that everyone here can sit down and spend some time with the story map or the report itself and find ways that it hooks more directly into their work. But I'm excited to move from our part of the presentation to hearing your questions, and we can discuss that together. And I'll pass it on to Andrea for that.
Thank you. And thanks, Zoe and April, for giving such a good presentation. We had a few questions come in during the presentation that we were able to answer, but please do keep adding those questions to our Q&A box, and we will, I think, start those questions now. So our first question was, why didn't we look at this data at the city or neighborhood level? Why did we stick to looking at the statewide and the regional level? Maybe Jesse can kick us off.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrea. I can take a pass at that. I'm Jessie Partridge-Guerrero. I'm the Director of Data Services at MAPC. So this is a great question. We did put a lot of thought into what level of geography we wanted to include in our analysis. We did not end up looking at the municipal scale for a couple reasons. One very logistical reason, which is that the data we use to understand household characteristics, which is the census's ACS microdata or PUMS, is not available for most municipalities. It's sort of aggregated at sizes with populations of 100,000 or more, which typically are not at the municipal scale. But the other sort of more philosophical reason is that our housing crisis and our gap of affordable housing demand is not a municipal challenge. It's really a regional and statewide challenge. And, there are some municipalities that may have very limited numbers of low-income households within their municipal bounds, but that does not mean that they should not be part of the solution. So we decided to keep our analysis. What Zoe shared was all statewide. We do have regional statistics, so at the RPA scale, and those are available on that story map that we published in the Q&A. But again, we decided not to look at the municipal scale. But we do, some of our recommendations include working with local officials and leaders to understand that local context and how municipalities can be part of the solution within the context of their region.
Thanks, Jesse. Our next question, Judith asked, how do mixed immigrant status households fit into this report?
So that's another good question. I would say because our understanding of household characteristics comes from that census ACS microdata data source, it includes immigrants to the degree that immigrant households have filled in ACS surveys. We do know there's an undercount of immigrant households as well as other low-income households and households of color in the ACS survey. So it's certainly likely that there is a little bit of an undercount of, in particular, undocumented immigrant households. And unfortunately, we don't have a reliable data source to understand the characteristics of those households, but certainly something worth further sort of tailored research.
Thanks, Jesse. And Mimi asked a good question about the gap for units available to market rate renters versus renters with lower incomes. Is there a housing crisis for those market rate renters, and what is the vacancy of that market rate supply?
I was
I'll
gonna say,
start
plug
and
your
then
state report, I think. Is that
the statewide housing plan?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, HLC, the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, did just publish a statewide housing plan, which does sort of tackle the housing crisis sort of across the board, which is a great resource. Somebody should find the link to that and put it in the chat. But this research really did focus solely on low-income households and the income-restricted affordable housing supply.
Thanks, Jesse. We actually don't have any other questions at this time, so we'll give folks maybe a minute or two to noodle on all the information that was presented. Please do add your questions to the Q&A, and we just got one, so that's good. Thanks, Bill. So how do you see the state's new superpower, ADUs by right, we love accessory dwelling units, filling the gaps that you've identified?
April, do you want to take that?
Sure, I can start and you can fill in. I was just going to say in sort of thinking through the findings and the policy recommendations for this report, there are some levels of opportunity. Like we did show that relatively large gap for smaller households. It does tend to be much easier to build for these households, and ADUs are a great idea and a new kind of tool in the toolkit to reach them. So I think there's still some more thinking, just from my personal opinion, about what we've seen around how to reach those very low income households. I think ADUs go some of the way, but we need additional tools to make those accessible to households with very low incomes. But I do think it's like I said, there's opportunities in all of these findings. And I think that small household one is really interesting because there's a lot of new ideas around it that I think will be good to deploy. But MAPC team, I also know this is a special topic for you guys. So if you want to add.
No, I think you covered it. That's great, April. Our next question is related to one of our recommendations regarding using inclusionary zoning as a way to reach deeper affordability. And so Tom mentions that one of our recommendations is to amend your local ordinances to reach 30 to 50% AMI levels instead of just that 60 to 80% or higher. And in the question, he notes that in Waltham, they have reduced their inclusionary zoning to go deeper, and it's actually not produced as much housing. And so I think here at MAPC, that's something that we see a lot. We are constantly trying to work with our communities to improve their inclusionary zonings and make it so that it's producing housing. And it is tough to go deeper. And so I think what we've been doing on the MAPC side with the housing team actually is researching different ways to layer different subsidies to help with that feasibility, financial feasibility of inclusionary requirements. So I think that we don't get into it too much in the report, but we will certainly be referencing additional research that we've done on inclusionary zoning as we continue to build out this report and the resources related to it to help implement some of those recommendations. April, I don't know if you have anything else to add on your side or anyone else on the panel. All right, so we have another question. We have a small municipal voucher program in Somerville that Penelope is mentioning, wondering if there are other models or opportunities out there. I'm happy to see it as a tool or recommendation. She notes that theirs is project-based and mobile voucher options. So not sure if the panel wants to share anything else regarding the vouchers and the connection to the findings.
No, but thank you for calling that out. It's great to know and spotlight. And I think to the extent that other people know of models, I know of a few towns that are thinking about it. But I do not know a large pool of them that have actually implemented it, but I'm hoping we'll see more of that going forward.
Great, thanks. And then our next question is from Sarah, and this might be a good one for you, April, based on your experience with the affordable housing providers. How do you recommend accessing project-based vouchers for existing units? She says that they've been trying to do that without success as a small nonprofit housing organization with income-based units.
I'm going to answer with a slight deferral on this one because it is also a little bit outside the expertise of Housing Navigator. The project-based vouchers are usually allocated by either a housing authority, a locality, a state government, and there's different pathways to reach them. It's a little bit complicated, and I feel unable to give advice on behalf of Housing Navigator on that specifically. But again, we're hoping this research encourages more people to increase the pool of project-based vouchers. Again, that can be an uphill battle with funding where it is, but we think it's really important, especially when we look at these deeply affordable households. So my long way around answer to the question is hopefully we can make more vouchers available, which will make nonprofits like you more able to access them.
Thanks, April. So Barbara had another question related to accessory dwelling units. Is the assumption underlying accessory dwelling units is that they will provide housing for people related to the property owner, or a property owner is generally willing to rent to unrelated tenants? And that's actually something good that happened with the new state law. Whenever accessory dwelling units were passed by right statewide, occupancy restrictions requiring relatives or family members to be those living in the accessory dwelling units was no longer allowed as part of the local regulation framework. And so in theory, property owners could rent out their accessory dwelling units if they want to. It's still up to property owners as the owners of that property. And so it's on the table, but doesn't have to be implemented. I'm not seeing too many other questions come in. So I think we might give folks 1 or 2 more minutes, and then I'll pass it off to Mark Jason to close us out. All right, go ahead and take us away, Mark. Thanks.
Thanks to everyone. I'm going to make just a few points about the research and then do a bunch of thank yous. One of the most significant things I think about this research is that it clearly highlights an issue that is known in the housing community, but generally not appreciated by policymakers. Most policymakers think when you build an affordable unit, you build an affordable unit. And they have very little recognition of the fact that if you tie the rent of that unit to the income of the person occupying it, you have a much more useful subsidy than if you simply set the rent of that unit based upon a fixed market amount. If you set the price, say at, what a family earning 60% of median income could afford, and then you say everyone under 60% of median income can live in that unit, the reality is that most of those people are not going to be able to afford to live in the unit. And unfortunately, most of the units we produced many, many years ago were in the first category, and most of the units we're producing today are in the second category. And if we're not going to change our programs, the only way around that is to substantially increase the number of mobile vouchers that we give people. And while it is a good idea for individual municipalities to try and run programs of their own, it is very difficult for individual municipalities to run those programs. And there are a lot of mobility issues because people don't necessarily always stay in one community. We really have to make sure that the Commonwealth is providing additional money from the perspective of filling those vouchers and giving them to people and enabling people to truly take advantage of what we are calling affordable housing in Massachusetts. I'll also make one other point about age restrictions. I've traveled the state. I've been in almost every community in the Commonwealth over my career. And one of the saddest things is to see a community with affordable housing, all of which is age restricted, which was mentioned earlier in the presentation, I think that April was giving, or Zoe. And it's really problematic when you hear that grandparents raising their grandchildren are not allowed into an age-restricted unit. You come to understand that most of the time, not always, those age-restricted units do not exist for the purpose of serving older people. They exist for the purpose of excluding children. We need more age-restricted units. We have a growing demographic in that area, but it can't come at the cost of not building the units we need for families with children. And that also is an incredibly important policy goal that I hope we will all continue to pursue. I want to give special thank you, first of all, to the Keene Foundation. I had the great honor in my life of knowing Bob Keene before his untimely death about 15 years ago. The foundation which supported this research, which supports Keene Fellows, I'm sure many of whom are probably on the call right now, and does very important other work, certainly for the Navigator, has been an incredibly powerful force in the housing field in Massachusetts and from that perch beyond Massachusetts. So I really want to thank the Keene Foundation. I want to thank my dear friend of many, many decades now, Jennifer Gilbert, even though she's not here with us today. She is the motive force and founder of the Navigator, and Jerome, because usually you hear this statement somewhat annoyingly made to women who are going to replace men. I am going to say to you that you have very big shoes to fill, and also to welcome you to this position. On the Navigator staff, I want to really thank April and Emma. I also want to thank on my team, Zoe and Lily Perkins High, who runs our Analytical Services Division, Jesse Partridge Guerrero, of course, who runs Data Services, Andrea Harris Long, who runs Land Use. Also not in the presentation, Emma and Casey and Alexis, all of whom added to the work that you saw before you here today. I want to thank Senator Edwards. She is always a tremendous leader to us. We're going to count on you, Lydia, going forward into this new session to make sure we can accomplish great things in the housing field, just as we did in the last session with the passage of the Affordable Homes Act. And I also want to mention Senator Brownsberger, who I don't think is with us here today, but we had a number of very interesting conversations and useful conversations about the data with Senator Brownsberger, who tends to follow some of these data issues very, very closely. It's one of the most charming aspects of his personality that you don't often see in public office. And I want to thank him very much for noodling with us on these data issues. We have a lot more work to do, folks. Let's consider this a start to that work.